Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be working on resumes and resume pages. So, first off, we're going to talk about resumes in document form, take a look at some examples, and try to give some guidance, especially for those of you who might not have done a resume before, or maybe you have done a resume, you just haven't updated it in a while. So we'll take a look at some document versions, and then we will look at how to get your resume page created and get the content on there. We'll start off in Schoology on our materials page. I've added some example resumes near the bottom, as well as a assignment drop box for your resume. So here I'm asking you to turn in a document, PDF or Word document, something like that, of your resume that I could take a look at and give you some feedback on. See if I can give any comments on how to strengthen it. So I'm not grading them. I'm not sort of assigning it as a grade. I just want to see them and give you some feedback, help make them as strong as they can be. And you will have to post a PDF of your resume on your resume page. So you'll need to have that document, revised, updated anyway. So I wanted you to go ahead and turn that into the Dropbox sometime in the next few days when you get a chance. Would be great. So I can take a look and see if I can help you out on your resume. So here we've got some student examples, and these are examples that I pulled off of the internet. So this one, you see contact information at the top. There's a short sort of descriptive sentence here that is basically an objective. Sometimes people will have an objective statement at the top of their resume, the first item that goes under the contact info. And that's the case here. It's just he didn't identify it as an objective. But seeking a growth role in marketing is certainly an objective there. So if you want to do an objective statement, you can. You definitely want to keep it to just a sentence. It can be a slightly longer sentence than this. That's fine, but you want to keep it to a sentence. And you want to try to be as specific as possible. But in the case of writing up a generic resume that you're going to post on your website, you don't want to be so specific that it would sort of rule you out of some opportunities. So if you're a marketing major, and that's what you're wanting to go into, I think that's fine. Okay, so there's the objective statement. He's got a summary here, which is unusual. The bullet points here are just a more detailed description, but this isn't a particularly helpful section. I wouldn't recommend this for most people. And then education. Notice there's the degree that he's working toward. There's an anticipated graduation date and GPA listed. Now, you definitely want to include where you're going to school, what degree you're working toward. I would just put expected May 2018, or in this case, it would be in the future. The word expected, I think, would be fine. You wouldn't have to write out anticipated graduation necessarily. You could include a GPA if it is maybe 3.5 or above. Probably anything much lower than that, and you'll just want to leave it off there. But 3.4, 3.5, anything above that, I think would be fine. Certainly wouldn't hurt. I also would not suggest putting this much space in between here. Normally you'd want to keep this section a little bit shorter because this is just one entry for college. And normally under education, you're also going to list your high school here, at least until you graduate college. So I would try to condense this down a little bit. There's a lot of white space in between the lines there. And then this person, I like this example resume because this person actually has no work experience. And that's okay. I mean, that's just the situation some people are in. And so many of you may very well have work experience, but some of you might not. And so you may be wondering, well, how do I write a resume? What am I going to put on there when I haven't had a job? So this person did what I think is a really smart thing by listing related coursework where he's basically identified classes that he's taken to work toward his ultimate goal, right? And so this is kind of a great section. Now, some of you who may not have much work experience also haven't been students for very long. So you may not have very much coursework that you could identify as relevant coursework, stuff that would show off things about you that you would want to include on a resume. I would suggest if you are planning on taking courses in the fall, if you've already scheduled courses and you've got one or two on there that are sort of specific, particular, helpful to your major, you could list those even though you haven't taken them yet. And then you could just put, the term for next fall. Other courses even further in the future that you intend to take, I would think it would be fine to list those and just give it a future date as well. And then you really want to think about what have you already taken that you could really maximize, that you could use to show a good quality about yourself to a potential employer. So that might be if you are taking a foreign language this year, that would be something you would want to identify. Pretty much any job that you'd be looking for, any kind of office position you might apply for anywhere, certainly having foreign language on there is helpful. It doesn't hurt. And if you're taking classes for it right now, that's fine. Those might be good classes to identify. Also, any classes you may have taken that involved sort of computer skills, because pretty much, most jobs require some kind of computer skills. So it's good to show you've got some familiarity with those. So there's a potential section you could do. I would only do this if you don't have a lot of work experience and or you do have some courses worth listing and identifying on here. I wouldn't do it for every course you've taken. And if you do have some work experience, you could use a section like this, but I wouldn't include very much in there. I would keep it simple and just focus on courses that are obviously beneficial to your ability to sell yourself to a potential employer. And then the marketing work experience here, it's an internship, which is good. Internships are great, but it's not actual work experience. It's probably a smart way that he's gone about identifying it as work experience, because it is. It's just he didn't actually have a job there, right? And then key skills. This is a good section, particularly any kind of software that might not be, sort of widely known. So like Microsoft Office Suite is fine to list, but I wouldn't list Microsoft Word because at this point in 2020, sort of everybody's expected to know how to use Microsoft Word. But if you know how to use some other things like Adobe products that tend to be things like InDesign and Photoshop that are very powerful platforms, but are not very user-friendly, those are great things to mention. And he probably keeps it simple here because he's intending to use this to apply for marketing jobs. But I would say this could even be maximized more by listing some of the software within the Creative Suite. And then he happens to mention social media platforms. Now, that's because he's a marketing major, and so he may end up actually applying for jobs that would involve running social media accounts for a company. That may not be the best idea for everybody, but, if you use Instagram and Twitter and some other stuff, you could list that, especially if you think you may be applying for jobs that might be seen as beneficial. It definitely should encourage you, if you haven't done this already, to really carefully curate your web presence, to really go through whatever social media accounts you may have and check what kind of things have you posted, what kind of pictures might be on there. Are there things that you should remove, delete, lock down, change the privacy settings on so that you don't present yourself in a way that would work against you? And then because I found these on the internet, they include this kind of paragraph description talking about it. So I've posted these example resumes on Schoology. You can pull them up there yourself and look at them in more detail and be able to have them in front of you. Now this person, this is another student example. This person does have some work experience. And so she's gone ahead and put that right up front. And she also includes kind of, this isn't really an objective, it's just kind of a description, but it sort of works like an objective there, I suppose. And then notice her work experience is still an internship, which is great, it's worth mentioning, but it's not actual job experience. It's a little bit different. Program assistant, any kind of on-campus jobs that you have had or have now would be great to include as well. Don't forget about those. Volunteer experience is great. That's the kind of extracurricular activities people really look for. And some people might have an on-campus job as a tutor, as a peer tutor as well. She's included a skills section here, and hers has some very sort of specific items for her field, right? So this SOX compliance expertise, that's something that if she's applying for a job in her field, she's assuming that, anybody looking at this resume is going to see that and probably understand what it is and see the benefit in somebody coming in who already knows how to use it. And so that's a great thing to include, but it's also the kind of specific software that most of you might not be able to include, at least not yet, unless you have maybe had some kind of internship experience. She's got her education section here. And so notice the top one is the current school, her degree that she's working for, an expected graduation date, and then she's listed some other things below here, which is a little bit unusual, but she's decided instead of just doing this as an education section to make it education and extracurriculars. I wouldn't really recommend that. Usually, if you wanted to name some extracurricular activities you're involved in now, including student clubs, you could do that. I would just have a separate section just for those. I wouldn't try to include that in with education. And as I mentioned before, if you haven't graduated college yet, you should probably list your high school here too. Awards and honors, certainly if you've made the dean's list, you could mention that. You don't necessarily have to mention how many times unless it's a lot. And then here we get the paragraph description again. So normally this would not be in a resume. It's just on this one because where I got these examples from, they included some discussion of the example resumes. So I think these are good examples. I like the first one in particular because it does give you some ideas of how you can do a resume even if you don't really have any work experience. Some suggestions I have for how to do things differently while you are in college: you always want to mention your education first. Unless you are applying for a job and something from your work experience is directly relevant to it, while you're in college, your education should be listed first. Now, after you graduate, you want to remove anything about your high school and just to include information about college. And you want to perhaps move that below work experience, at least as long as you've got some relevant work experience. But for the time being, I think you want education first. And if you don't have much work experience when you graduate, you might still keep education at the top. You just might drop any information you have about your high school. So this example, the first of the two, does a better job of that. He's got this summary section that's probably not a good idea, and it's just kind of wasting space. The objective is fine, even though it's not identified as an objective. but then education being at the top is what you should do as well. And then he did related coursework, but as I mentioned before, you don't have to do a section like that. You could, I suppose it makes sense to have that be following up the education section right here. Then you want your work experience, and a skills section is optional. If you've got some things that you think you could list there, like I said, especially any kind of software you might be familiar with that maybe not everybody's familiar with, and you have space on your resume to do it, I would say go ahead and do it. But if not, that's okay. Or if you just don't want to do a skills section right now, that's okay. So really the minimum that your resume needs now is education, work experience, and contact info. You can have an objective. It certainly doesn't hurt. It would come at the top just below the contact info. You can have skills. It would come at the bottom. But that's the sort of minimum expectations of a resume, is who you are, what your education is, what kind of work experience you have. So take a look at your resume you've done, if you have one around, even if it's been a while since you've looked at it. See what you can update, see what you can change on there. Think about how you might best maximize the benefit of what you're listing. Now, because I don't have the opportunity to work with each of you in class on your resumes, I did want to include some additional discussion of ways to do that kind of maximization, of trying to take whatever items you can put on your resume and get the most out of them that you possibly can. So this is an example resume. This is one I worked on with someone years ago. It's a little bit different than what I am suggesting for you, in part because the kinds of jobs he was applying for, seeking a full-time position as an assembly service technician. So that's a perfectly fine job to apply for, but it's one that education might not be all that relevant to. And in his case, the only thing he could list on education was attending high school and then earning a GED a few years after that, which again is fine, but it's different from your position as college students. So this is a little bit different, but I thought it would be a good example, particularly for people who have some work experience, but maybe the kind of work that you don't really think will be very beneficial to talk about. So for instance, if you've done any kind of landscaping work, or if you worked at a fast food place, you may think, oh, that's not really going to do very much good for me in applying for, more professional kind of jobs. There's still ways you could talk about what you did in those positions that can be beneficial. So this person has contact info at the top. He's got his objective. It's actually 2 sentences, but it's still not terribly long. And notice the formatting of this is different. So there are lots and lots and lots, hundreds, maybe thousands of resume templates floating around on the internet and on Google Docs and Microsoft Word that you could use. And you can, kind of decide based on your own taste and preferences what you think will work best for you. You just want to keep in mind, some of the sort of basic principles of design that we're talking about with your websites, that we're going to be talking about with your websites, that, you don't want to use a template or a design that's going to somehow work against you in some way. He's gone ahead and listed skills at the top. I would normally suggest doing that below experience, but in this case, he thought it was beneficial to name stuff up front. And then experience is all sort of manual labor work, which again is fine. Notice that it is in reverse chronological order. That is how all items on a resume should be. So your education, any work experience that you have, the most recent one should be the first one. and then they get older as you go down. So if you worked at a landscaping business last year and ran a cash register at Wendy's the summer before that, then you would have landscaping first and then Wendy's second, so that the further down you go, the older the items are. So, same thing for education. You would want to list your current college education that you are working toward, and then have high school below that. So here there's the positions listed, reverse chronological order, descriptions of where the place is, the employer, the location, and then the job title that he had there. You usually want to include that, even if you have to kind of make one up because you didn't really have a title where you were at. You can probably make one up that would be accurate and would still sort of sound good. So, like general contractor for doing work for an individual, that's a good way to sort of describe that. Another issue with this resume is there are some inconsistencies, and some of the phrasing is not probably the way it should be. So the last item here, wired and installed ceiling fans, replaced fuse box, installed appliances, plaster work, stomping ceilings, drywall and mudding, painting, general restoration, landscaping. So these are all verbs. The sentence starts with a verb and it's in the past tense because it's a previous job, right? So when you are describing your work experience at any place, you always leave out the noun. You leave out I, because the implication with a resume is all of this should be your work experience. So you leave out the I and you just start with the verb. And if it's a previous job, you would use it in the past tense, right? So wired, installed, installed. This would be plastered if it was, reworded a little bit. So some of this is right here. But above, he wasn't as consistent about that. So this one for a previous job should be something like ran heavy equipment, or operated heavy equipment, I should say. So operated's the verb and it's in the past tense. Operated heavy equipment, maintained mechanics, repaired heavy equipment, that kind of thing. And then a present job, you can stick with present tense. Work from a build book to assemble natural gas compressors, cylinders, other components, building pistons, connecting rods, force feed lubricators, installing valves, custom bending. So here we've got present tense verbs, but it didn't start out right. So some of this is a good way to do it. Some of it isn't. You want to keep in mind that convention of start with the verb, leave out the noun because it's all I. And if you're talking about any kind of previous experience, use past tense. Okay, so let's take another look then at those example resumes, since we've covered a few more conventions of resumes here. So this one, like I said, was nice because it does have education near the top. So related coursework. So he does the good job of starting with the verb, and he varies up which kind of verbs he uses, right? The only issue might be that he's using present tense throughout, and that really doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense if you're talking about things that you did in a previous job or a previous course, right? So develop, discuss, but then the older the courses are, so this fall, then the older courses, this should be analyzed, reviewed, developed, and older than that, reviewed, developed. So remember, reverse chronological order, start with verbs when you're describing what you did. Here he did better, provided, participated, monitored. So that example works better there. So she's got a current internship, this is for internship, and so it's all current present tense verbs, right, which is great. And then the previous experience answered collated, managed, so that's all past tense, which is good. So another thing I'll mention on here before we shift over to the resume page on your website, if you do have work experience that you're not sure how to describe what you did in any way beyond, served fast food or something like that, think about if there's anything that you did for that employer that involved handling money, working well with other people as part of a team, working well individually, autonomously, without supervision, anything that you did involving communicating with customers or clients, anything that you did if you ever helped sort of train incoming employees. Those are all items you would want to list. You may not think about it, right? You might think, oh, I was at Wendy's, I serve fast food. But in fact, if you ran a cash register, you handled money. And mentioning that helps show that you are trustworthy, right? That you've handled somebody else's money. If you did any kind of customer service, you'd want to mention that, right? Any way of working with the public, communicating with the public. If you help design one of the promotional boards that they would stick outside of your Wendy's, you could find a way to word that to be helpful, to show that you assisted in communication and marketing and public relations. So anything that shows that you are trustworthy, that you work well with others, that you have good communication skills, that you can be the public face of a company, those are all good things to mention. And they're often things you can mention from jobs that you wouldn't necessarily think much about. So if you worked for a small landscaping company and basically mowed lawns, you might think that you would just say, landscaping, mowed lawns. But if you ever collected payment from customers, clients, then you could mention that. If you ever helped train a new employee, you want to mention that. One of the Wendy's jobs I had when I was a teenager involved training a lot of new employees. So that's the exact kind of thing you would include. Handle money, train employees, new employees, that sort of thing. So really think about how you can optimize any details of what you did, anything from your work experience or your education. And this is something I can help with as well. So one of the reasons why I want you to submit your resume document to the Dropbox is so that I can take a look and see if I can come up with any additional comments or feedback that could help you strengthen it, make it that much better. So you want to make sure that you get that in sometime fairly soon. So now we're going to shift gears and talk about your resume page and how to get that created and set up on your website. So I've signed into WordPress. I'm in my site menu. I've just gotten into it, so it's still got the little home thing up here. I'm going to go to Pages. And so I've got that About page that I worked on last week, and hopefully you've got one that you've been working on as well. So that's in there, a draft of it at least, and we may want to add and revise some things, but for now we'll leave that alone. We want to add a new page. Now it's probably even more important to make sure that you're using a blank layout, because resumes generally have a very there are certainly different sort of templates, different ways you can organize it, but they have a very kind of particular structure to them, a sort of outline structure with bullet points and things usually. So it's going to be much easier to do that if you're not trying to match it up with one of your page templates. Probably even if you have a resume template, which some of your themes might. So I'm going to go ahead and add title. I'll make this resume. Normally when I type resume, I put the accents on both E's, but for the page title, I'm not going to. And then here's where you want to add information from your resume. Now, some things to mention here. You don't want to include your contact info because this is going on your website. It's one of your pages. You're going to have a contact page. You already have an about page. So putting contact information here would be unnecessarily redundant. There are some ways you can be redundant about things that can be helpful, but contact info here probably wouldn't be. So I would start with an objective statement if you have one. If not, go ahead and start with education. Now, it's been a very long time since I've done a resume for myself. Academics use a different document called a CV, a curriculum vitae, that is like a resume, but much longer and has some different conventions to it. But I did do a resume at some point while I was working on my PhD. So I have a copy of that. So it's old, but it'll serve our purposes today. The particular layout I went with, I still kind of like for a few reasons, some of which will be clearer when we talk more about basic design principles in terms of sort of the width of this column and things. But there are some things I could have done differently. Because I did these descriptions in paragraph form, they've ended up somewhat long. And so usually it is a good idea to try to stick with a resume that doesn't go over a page. But sometimes you've got enough stuff on there that it has to go over a page. That's probably okay, but if you absolutely have to go over a page, you want to make sure that you are using your space wisely. So if I was doing this for most positions where I might not know if they would be okay with a resume this long, I might actually try to come up with a way to condense it so where it could just fit on a page. And that might end up being, converting some of these things to bullet points. It might be changing around my column structure so that I don't have all this white space over here between dates. There are lots of possibilities for that, ways that I could redo this to condense it down to a page, especially if I, reformatted this into 3 columns so that it only went a few items down and I dropped the oldest of my work experience. Let's go ahead and see how we can get some of the information off of here onto your resume page. Now, what you probably do not want to do is to try to copy and paste all of your resume onto your resume page. Because even if when you first paste it, it looks okay, it probably won't end up being okay. Because Microsoft Word and Google Docs, the formatting that they use isn't the same formatting that websites use. They're usually going to change some things around. This one isn't terrible, but it could have been. If we look back at the document resume, notice that education and experience are both this level in the sort of outline format, right? This level of heading. And so this level of heading is bold, it's a certain size, it's all caps, and it's underlined. Other things I've got bold or italicized, depending on what those items are. But when I pasted the whole thing into my resume page, it screwed all that up. So education still looks the way I wanted it to, but experience doesn't. Some of my italics might be here, maybe some aren't. It's changed the spacing. Of course, it's moved my dates into weird places. This certainly could be worse, but it's still, there's a lot of things I would have to do to fix this. So that's not what you want to do. What I recommend, if you have a document resume that you've already been working on, which I hope that you do by now, then you might try to copy and paste sections from it. So I've already mentioned we don't want contact information on here. If you have an objective statement first, that's fine. I'm going to try to do education and just see what I get with that. So I'm going to do a section at a time, and hopefully that way, if I have to fix formatting things, it's not quite so overwhelming or difficult to find all of it. So I would definitely need to play around with stuff a little bit to get this formatted correctly, change the spacing around. But overall, this isn't too bad. And then if I go back to my document, let's try my experience section and see what it does with it this time. Okay, so interestingly, it did the same thing. Something about the coding in Word does not have this show up the same way that this does. So that's something I'll have to go in and fix, right? I still need to go in and fix my dates so they line up. So you're going to have to put some work into formatting things correctly on your page. It's not going to be super quick and simple to make it look on your resume page the same way it looks on your resume. So I'm just going to try to do a quick version of this. It may not come out quite as nicely as I would like to if I spent more time on it, but in this case, I'm just using it for an example. If I haven't mentioned this to you before, when you're in a text block, a paragraph block, and this is true of web design everywhere, not just on WordPress, if you're typing in text, normally when you hit enter, it's going to give you double spacing. If you want single spacing, hold down on Shift and press enter. And now notice that's single spaced instead of the double spacing like it is here. So I'm going to go through and try to very quickly do some fixes here. You can also move blocks up and down this way. I'm going to make this single space too, so Shift enter. And let's see if I can do some fairly quick fixes like that for everything. Okay, so at least my education section's working better. I'll need to do that for my experience section too, but I don't want to take the time to do that right now during my video here, so I'll worry about that later. A little bit more with the formatting here. So this is right now simply bold. Now what we could do is use our heading formatting that we're using for our web page, for our website. And we can change this to a heading and then change the level of it. And that may prove to be an easier way to make this all consistent. So if I know that's a heading level 3, I can quickly make this a heading level 3 as well. And then I just have to capitalize it, of course. Okay, so I know those are consistent now. Now, if we look back at the paper resume, remember that for education, I had degrees in bold and no italics or anything, just degrees in bold. So if I wanted to stick with something like that, I can. And it's not a bad idea to have some way of breaking things up a little bit so that you don't just have plain text everywhere, right? And so this is, again, it's more sort of design stuff that we'll talk about some more probably next week. So I've gone ahead and put those in bold. Work experience is still a little bit of a mess, but it's, for now, it's a draft. So my resume page, education, work experience, and then I want to put those skills on here too. But like I said, if you don't have something like that, that's fine. It'll change the formatting of my bullet points for sure. So here I know I want to make this heading H3 and then all caps. I suppose I removed the underlining there, didn't I? That's underlined, that's underlined. I better add it back in here too. Here we go, underline. Except it undid my highlight. There we go. You have to watch for issues like that where it removes some of the text from your highlighted text. That can make creating links a little bit trickier. So as soon as we get into links, you'll want to keep that in mind. You got to make sure that everything that you wanted to make into a link is what actually does get turned into it. I could play around with some more formatting here too. Remember some of the ways I was describing how we could do this in paper form. I certainly don't need to do it on my resume page, because one of the beauties of doing a resume page is that it's a web page, and so it can do things that a regular paper resume can't do. So it's very easy and not at all a problem to go over a page or even over 2 pages if we really wanted to. Let's see, I've got 3, 3, 3. Yeah, I've got 9 items here, so let's see if this works. Cut. List. Now we'll paste. Cut and paste. Set to the add my spaces back in. Okay, and then I can go ahead and remove this block. All right, great. So except for the formatting for my experience being a little funky, I think I'm going to be okay with this so far. I could preview. I like just publishing it and then seeing what it actually looks like, unless you're really afraid that something's going to be not the way you want it to be. Yeah, so this is pretty good. If my width of my inner page here was a little bit wider, I might be able to put all this on single lines like it is in my edit mode. I could make some further tweaks to try to make that happen, but I'm not really concerned about it. So I have a resume page with all of my relevant resume items on there. I don't need the contact. I don't need my name because the whole website is me and my name. So I can just start off with education, or if you have an objective statement, you'll want to start with that. Okay, so we've got our resume page ready to go. There's one other thing I want to cover with your resume page. So I'm going to get back into edit mode. I mentioned to you in passing earlier that I'm going to want you to add a downloadable document of your resume. Now that's redundant. kind of like including contact or name would be. But it's a redundancy that I think is helpful because you may very well end up with a potential employer looking at your website and looking at your resume page, and maybe they want to print out a copy of your resume because they're a small company that their HR department still uses a lot of paper, and keeps track of things that way. Or maybe they're just somebody who uses a lot of paper themselves, and so they like to print things out and read them on pages and actually have a stack of paper resumes in front of them. So the redundancy here is a good idea because you want to make it as easy as possible for a potential employer to get whatever resume information from you they can get that might help you get a job or an internship. So I want to add a button or a link somewhere. We're going to do links next time. And I think because I want this to stick out, I think I'm going to go with a button. So I'm going to add a new block here. And remember, the different options you have here could change depending on your theme. So I'm going to go with button. I'll just make it download PDF. I need to make this a link. Okay, so here's where it's going to get a little bit tricky for us. So I need to upload the resume. Let me go ahead and save this. Okay, I've saved my resume page. I've got the button on there, but I haven't actually connected it to my resume yet. But I've got it updated, so it's saved. So I'm going to pause there. Now we need to upload the resume. So here, I'm going to go to Media, and I'm going to add New. And I need to find on my computer where I've got my resume. Okay, so I found my resume. I've already turned it into a PDF, which if you don't know how to do that, that's certainly something I can help you with. I could even cover in an upcoming video if enough people would like additional help with that. But I've already turned mine into a PDF, so now I've just uploaded it, right? And so it's in my media on my website. So now that it's in there, I need to select it. And I'm going to go ahead and click Edit because I need to pull up the info on it. So now I'm in edit mode for my image, or for my document, my resume. I'm not worried that it doesn't show it to me here. My concern is this URL. So this is the URL just for the resume. You could link directly to this, use this link, put it on another website, and it would take somebody to your resume. I need it in order to add my button and make it work. So now that I've got that, I'm going to go back to Pages, get back into my resume page. I'm going to select my button and add the link. And so this is the link I need. So search or type URL. That's the URL that I found. That is from my media. I want to click enter. So now it looks like a link in here. So I'm going to update. Now, anytime you add a link or anything like that, you always want to test it. So there's what my button looks like. And I click it, and it has downloaded my resume. Okay? So your resume page ultimately needs to have most of the content from your resume, at least education and any kind of experience you have. And it has to have a link or a button to download a PDF version of your resume. All right, so next time we'll get into images. I'll talk about how to find the kinds of images you need and how to actually get those and add them to your pages. So I will see you then.